Coming up, a fascinating ethical journey.
I believe passionately that when you release people to follow their ideals and their political passions, then extraordinary change is possible. We can fix these things.
Independent Diplomat Executive Director Carne Ross discusses his moral failures in the British Foreign Service and a new vision for statecraft. It's just ahead on Global Ethics Forum.
Carne Ross is a former British diplomat who resigned over the Iraq War. Carne's second book, The Leaderless Revolution, was published by Penguin in 2012. Carne is also the founder and executive director of Independent Diplomat, an expert team of former diplomats and international lawyers. Independent Diplomat advises democratic but marginalized governments and political groups so that their views are heard internationally. So if you'd like to begin by just telling us some of your thoughts around what ethics have to do with leadership.
I thought what I might try and describe very, very briefly is what actually happened to me as a British diplomat, because if I have anything to say about ethics, I suppose it comes from that experience. I'm reminded of a former advisor to the British Foreign Secretary when I was speechwriter to the Foreign Secretary, who said, there is no such things as morals, there is just what you do. And I thought about that, and I thought about that when he and his foreign minister supported the war in Iraq. And I think there is a certain truth to it, because I don't think actually having ethical precepts or talking about ethics or morals or rules actually means a great deal, except in terms of guiding one's own actions, because it is actions that make the world, and one is responsible for one's actions. One is in a sense made in a existential way by one's actions. And I guess I learned this through a career of what I now look back on as an egregious moral failure in many ways. And so if my story has any lessons, that it is about what not to do rather than what to do. I became a diplomat in 1989, which was an extraordinary year to become a diplomat, because it was the moment of the triumph of the West, of the idea of liberal democracy and free markets, as a man who I think has spoken here at least a couple of times, Francis Fukuyama, suggested, it seems entirely erroneously, that we'd reached the end of history. And with that kind of suffusing sense of supremacy, I was sent out into the world along with my colleagues to kind of preach these mantras to the benighted parts of the world, particularly in Eastern Europe, that had not yet had the benefits of liberal democracy and free markets. And indeed, as a diplomat working for a government, you are not particularly encouraged to be questioning or self-doubting about the message that your government is transmitting to the world. Indeed, such is the kind of overwhelming and invasive sense of belonging to the state that actually you start to talk about the state as if it was actually you. So instead of saying Britain wants X, Y, Z, you say we want X, Y, Z. And I, looking back on that experience, have begun to feel that this was a way of distancing oneself from oneself literally from the self. That in the process of being inculcated into the culture of diplomacy, and this took place during my instruction as a young diplomat, one is somehow encouraged to divorce oneself from the individual state of, feeling oneself to be a person with agency, into becoming something else, which is a person who is the agent of the state. That literally, as a diplomat, you are the embodiment of the state. And that separation, to me, is a fatal one. It is one that is intrinsic to the system of diplomacy. It is one that is intrinsic to the nature of the state. And it's why, in fact, that I'm an anarchist today, because I believe that the state is fundamentally amoral and separates the individual, and particularly the exponents of the state, from their moral consciences. How I came to realize that is a long story. I had a really wonderful and extraordinary diplomatic career. I worked on all kinds of interesting things. I served in Germany, Afghanistan after the invasion, Norway. I worked on the Middle East peace process, global climate negotiations. And ultimately, what turned out to be my final posting was here at the UN in New York, where I was posted to the UK mission to the UN. And I was part of the British delegation to the UN Security Council, where my responsibility was the Middle East. and in particular Iraq, and in particular the issue of weapons of mass destruction, how we would ensure the verified removal of Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, and how we would impose sanctions upon Iraq to coerce it to fulfill its obligations to disarm itself of weapons of mass destruction. And this, I had thought, was the kind of apex of my career, or rather a step up this ascending arc of my career, which would inevitably end in an ambassadorship or being a senior official back in London. But in fact, this experience turned out to be the nemesis of my career. And at the time, I didn't really realize it. But looking back, the signs were all there, including in the emotional state that I often found myself doing that kind of work. But the main part of my work was negotiating sanctions on Iraq. And I don't know how much people now know about sanctions on Iraq. It tends to be overshadowed by debate over the war and did they lie or did they not. But in fact, in many ways, sanctions on Iraq were a far greater crime than the war that subsequently followed, because we imposed economic sanctions on Iraq which affected above all the civilian population of Iraq and not the leadership, not the government of Iraq, who were the presumed targets of Iraq. The sanctions and the economic deprivation that followed sanctions caused considerable civilian suffering. We like to blame this on the Saddam regime. We said that if they fulfilled their obligations to allow inspections of weapons of mass destruction sites, then of course there wouldn't need to be sanctions in the first place. And we also set up this thing called the Oil for Food program, whereby Iraq was permitted to sell limited amounts of oil in order to pay for what were called humanitarian goods, which would then be imported into Iraq to look after the civilian population. And I was extremely skilled in arguing this case. And if you'd met me at the time, if you'd met me 12 years ago, you would have been tremendously impressed by the fluency with which and persuasiveness with which I put these arguments. But the fact that I was fluent and persuasive, I'm afraid, blinded me to what was actually going on, which was that we were punishing the civilian population and there was extraordinary civilian suffering as a result of sanctions. And now, when I look back on that time, I feel considerably ashamed of what I did because I was an absolute intrinsic part of it. I negotiated the resolutions that imposed sanctions on Iraq. Line by line, I was known as a Rottweiler in the Security Council because I was so ferocious in defending the British-American line in the Security Council. In those days, the Security Council was divided between the Brits and the Americans, who demanded strict sanctions and strict weapons inspections as part of our policy of containing Iraq, and those who took a more, they wanted basically to let Iraq off the hook. This was France, the Russians, and others. And partly because the relationship in the Security Council between us and them was so incredibly antagonistic, it gave us a sense of kind of moral superiority, that we were defending the world against Saddam Hussein, that without us holding the line, Saddam would be allowed to rearm and kind of commit mayhem all over the world. But because I was by then I had long before lost the ability to actually interrogate my own moral conscience. I was surrounded by people who felt that we were doing the right thing. And if I had ever raised my hand and said, well, actually, is it possible that we're doing this a terrible thing rather than the right thing, I would have been instantly kind of marked as a sort of troublemaker and the worst kind of appellation that one can get in diplomacy, which is to be emotional. That one has emotions rather than the cold-eyed calculus of realpolitik and diplomacy. And of course, I was an ambitious young fellow, and I wanted to be a senior diplomat. And to admit to having emotions, to having a moral conscience about the actions that I was perpetrating for my state was something that was basically inadmissible. That would have been a career killer. It was somehow just not done in the sort of class-based way that British diplomats still govern each other. It was very clear that indulging in kind of emotional self-examination and moral philosophizing was completely infra dig. And instead, we regarded ourselves as kind of soldiers in the trenches of diplomacy, hurling words and phrases and missives at the other side. And it was brutal diplomatic warfare in those days. And everybody behaved incredibly badly. We all bugged each other. We all lied to each other. We all screamed and shouted at each other and made each other weep. It was very, very hard pounding. By the end of that period, I did that for 4.5 years until mid-2002, where my tour ended. And I went to the New School, in fact, and took a sabbatical and spent a year reading it in NYU library. And during that time, of course, the Iraq War took place. Extraordinarily, on the day that Baghdad fell, I found myself in an anti-war demonstration in Washington, D.C., wondering what the hell I was doing there. I was still a serving British diplomat. I was on sabbatical, but I was still a serving British diplomat. And I wondered what would happen if my colleagues would see me. But anyway, that took place. At the end of my sabbatical year, I was given the choice of returning to London and serving in the Foreign Office again or doing something else. And I felt so troubled and so upset by what had happened in the Iraq War that I felt I didn't want to go back to London. During that year, I had drafted several letters of resignation to my permanent undersecretary, which I'm afraid to say I didn't have the courage to send. And I was in a terrible quandary about what to do with myself and what to do with my life. And I felt like my identity was actually evaporating, which in a sense it was. I even grew a little beard, which I think was a kind of sign that somehow I was lost. I took a secondment to Kosovo, where I worked for the United Nations, because I really didn't feel I could go back to London and work in a department again. I just felt, I didn't know what I really felt. What I felt was very unarticulated. And I went to Kosovo instead. And whilst I was posted in Kosovo, I received a memo from the head of my foreign service saying all of those who'd worked on Iraq were invited to testify to the first British official inquiry into the war, which was into the use of intelligence in the run-up to the war, a very narrow, specific thing. Blair had very deliberately designed it as a very narrow thing because he didn't want a full public inquiry into the war. And I negotiated with the inquiry that had been set up that I would deliver my testimony in secret. And I did this because I wanted to protect my career. At that point, I didn't want to give everything up. And I felt that I could have it both ways, which was a kind of clear indication of my moral ambivalence and, in some ways, my cowardliness. But I negotiated to give my evidence in secret, and I'm listed as one of the 2 anonymous witnesses to this inquiry, the so-called Butler inquiry. And I sent my testimony off to London. And it was quite a long, detailed document explaining exactly how the British government had exaggerated the case for war, exactly how it had ignored available alternatives to war. This is a very neglected subject. We can talk about that at more length if you wish. But there were very much available alternatives to military invasion. But also how the war was illegal in terms of the resolutions that I myself had negotiated. When I sent it off, I remember very particularly the moment when I pressed the send button on my word processor in Kosovo and realizing that there was something irreversible about this act. And a couple of days later, I sent my testimony to the head of my foreign service as my resignation and said, I'm not coming back. He didn't reply. In fact, it was to my foreign secretary, and he didn't reply. And I quit and sort of jumped off a cliff. I had no idea what I was going to do next. And eventually set up this thing called Independent Diplomat, which is a diplomatic advisory service for marginalized countries and political groups around the world. Anyway, my evidence came out in 2007, and it led to calls for a full public inquiry because it was, the first time somebody who'd actually been involved in Iraq policymaking had testified that the government's case was exaggerated, to put it politely. But I think there were 3 things that I learned in that episode of what happened to me. The first is the sanctions thing. I have spent a great deal of time trying to work out why I did what I did, why I was involved in something that I now regard as really a terrible thing. And it was because I was surrounded by people who did the same thing. I'm afraid to say I am a sheep, a herd creature just like the rest of us. And of course there's ample evidence showing that people commit terrible crimes, including genocide, people who are perfectly ordinary in other circumstances. I recommend to you a book by Christopher Browning, which is about a group of ordinary men in Germany, bakers, teachers, postmen, who join this police battalion, and they're between about 400 of them. They're responsible for about 100,000 deaths of Jews on the Eastern Front. And it's an extraordinary book. It's called Ordinary Men, about how ordinary people do terrible things when put in the right circumstances. And I think that being in government has a kind of amoral permissibility about it, which is a terrible, terrible thing, that you are not held accountable for your actions in any real way. I have never been held accountable for what I did on sanctions. The only time I've been held accountable is by Iraqis I've met, some of whom have accused me of genocide of the civilian population. And that is, was uncomfortable, but wasn't real accountability. The other thing that I concluded from my experience is this idea of the heroic whistleblower kind of acting on their conscience, I think is in most cases pretty mythical, and in fact is very problematic as a kind of archetype of how people behave. Because certainly in my case, it wasn't a heroic act of conscience at all. As my story makes clear, I didn't resign at the time of the war. I didn't resign until 2004. And I resigned not because I thought, my God, I'm going to wave a flag for truth. Somebody has to do the right thing. I resigned because I just felt I couldn't go back to London and work with my colleagues. I just didn't respect my colleagues anymore. I didn't want to sit with Jack Straw. Jack Straw was the then Foreign Secretary, or potentially Tony Blair, with a smile on my face and pretend that I respected them, because I didn't. In many ways, I hated them. I think that heroic narrative of the whistleblower is very problematic, not least because it's very discouraging to people who might think of doing it. It sets up this kind of moral example of the sort of unimpeachable truth teller, which I think doesn't reflect the rather more coloured and confused and compromised reality of what we all are like. Had I had children, had I been 10 years older, I wouldn't have done it. There's absolutely no doubt. I would still be in the Foreign Office today, serving my time out in some, scummy little embassy somewhere. The third thing I concluded from it was that the only way you can save yourself from doing terrible things for government is having a very clear sense of your values and having a group of people who hold you to account for them. Subsequent to my career, there have been various people who've had an extraordinary moral influence on me and held me to account for my actions. And finding those people in one's life, I think, is tremendously important. But also stating to them what the moral maxims are, the ethical maxims are that you intend to live by. I do remember before I became a diplomat, because I was always a very political person, quite a radical, progressive person, saying to my sister, I will resign if they make me do something terrible. And by something terrible, I meant kind of, shooting Jews on the Eastern Front. Of course, moral choices are never so clear. They're not black and white. Doing sanctions on Iraq, it didn't feel like a moral choice. It just felt like something I did for my job. And only latterly was I able to evaluate it through any kind of moral prism. And I don't think this is very easy to do, to create this kind of accountability, and it requires one to be rigorous with oneself and one's friends and family to be rigorous with you too. And I'm afraid to say I certainly did not display that rigor at the time. And it's easy for me to preach about it now, but that's only because I know what happened, and I hope there are one or two lessons from what happened to me.
I teach international business at Pace University, and in one of my courses I used the Parag Khanna book, How to Run the World. And most importantly, my students read that book and are optimistic about the future because there's so much energy that young people can make things more positive. And I think your remarks could be perhaps interpreted as kind of bleak about the future.
Parag is a good friend of mine, but I don't share his kind of optimism about the world. I think it is possible it will go well, and I too share, I'm inspired and encouraged by the energy and intelligence of particularly people who are younger than me, millennial generation, whatever you want to call them, an extraordinary cosmopolitan engaged generation. I love them. But I do think we stand between dystopia and utopia. I think things are getting very bad in a number of ways. I think the world economy is in an extraordinarily febrile state where international legislation is not able to modulate it effectively. But above all, climate change, I think, is an absolute kind of terrifying catastrophe. And it's hard to be optimistic when one sees the total lack of effective action to address it. And this is why I appeal to people to act. I do have great faith in humanity. People think that I'm a terrible cynic because I believe in people. Oh, you're so cynical about government, that you're so cynical about the way things are. Actually, I believe passionately that when you release people to follow their ideals and their political passions, then extraordinary change is possible. We can fix these things. So I'm not a pessimist in the sense of, I'm not at all pessimistic about people, but I do believe if we carry on with systems designed for a much earlier dispensation, a much earlier set of circumstances, we're going to end up in deep trouble.
You went from being kind of an internal person with an internal narrative that you mentioned, kind of really getting to know how diplomacy works and functions, and then rejecting it and criticizing it from the outside, to now you're criticizing a system that you haven't worked inside from the outside. So I'm curious which you find more effective as we all think about,
Sure.
maybe being change agents, whether to spend some time inside, then move outside,
Sure.
and have that flexibility in our own careers.
I don't really regard myself as outside of diplomacy. I'm inside it still, just working for different actors. And it's a very different perspective working for Somaliland or Kosovo or the Sahrawi people of the Western Sahara than being a British diplomat. In some ways, it's a much richer one because I have a kind of panoptic view of diplomacy. I see it from the perspective of many. I've attended the UN Security Council in 4 different delegations. I'm not sure many people have done that. The inside-outside question is a really, really good question. It's one that not troubled me, but I thought about a lot before I joined the Foreign Office. I get asked that question a lot by folks considering joining the State Department or whatever. I'm afraid my answer is pretty stark, which is that the institution changed me, not the other way around. It divorced me from my conscience and from my true self and from my political beliefs and actually from my happy self. I'm much, much happier now than I was then. I thought I was a kind of iconoclast, I'd sort of, occasionally write something that was a little bit, provocative, but always within a certain limit. And, I got a reputation for that. The UK-US bilaterals on Iraq were sometimes called trilaterals because they were UK, US and Carne Ross. And I was very proud of this kind of, aren't I cool? I'm a bit of an iconoclast in the diplomatic service. But in truth, I think the institution uses people like me to pretend that it's in fact eclectic and open and democratic and encourages debate when in fact it doesn't. It is a deeply top-down organization where I found in my work that we were sent out to collect evidence for the top-down view, not to look at the world and form our own views about it and discuss what might be done about it. And in that way, I think it fundamentally altered the way I thought about things. I became kind of highly hierarchical in my thinking. I became very committed to a certain set of views. I became unable to think about alternative views. I was very, very aggressive. I was quite rigid. I'm still not exactly easy. And I have pretty firm views about things, but I'm exposed to so much more now. So I'm afraid to say my answer is it's not so much you're outside. I believe that reform from outside is basically impossible. Power doesn't reform itself. People who have power don't give it up lightly. In fact, they don't give it up at all unless you make them. But I believe in actually setting up alternative ways of doing things that are better. So I don't believe in reforming the banking industry by whining to my congressman, because that won't work. I believe in setting up new kinds of banks, which are, popularly supported. And who knows, if you hear about this, if you hear about the Occupy Money Cooperative, as it's called, then we will have succeeded.
You talked about taking down the king. Is there value in knowing your enemy in a way, in knowing what the system is so you can alter it?
That's absolutely a brilliant point because it's absolutely right. I couldn't do what I do today in diplomacy unless I had been a diplomat. In fact, independent diplomat only recruits people who've been diplomats. So it's very much the gamekeeper turned poacher model. That said, we are working within the system of diplomacy as it is currently constituted. And I sometimes worry that in independent diplomat, we're actually reaffirming that system by acting within it and not going outside and actually setting up alternate forms of communication, state-to-state communication. State-to-state diplomacy is a highly ossified, formal, protocolaire business, and we're not really changing that. We say, it must be more open and the marginalised must get a voice, and we are changing that to a degree, but in some ways it's a bit like me being the iconoclast in the Foreign Office. In some ways, I rather worry that the mere existence of organisations like mine, reaffirms the validity of the whole system, when in fact we should be talking about alternative systems. And that is my theory of change these days. I don't think you should reform systems which embed power imbalances. You should set up alternative systems and recruit people to those systems. That is, in any case, a lot more fun. Begging the powerful to change things a little bit, it's not fun. It makes you feel crap and humiliated and, oh, can I have a little bit of that, please? Oh, thank you. It's not empowering. It's not empowering at all. It's much, much better to say, screw that. There is actually a better way, and I'm going to set it up. It is so much more fun.
Thank you very much for some very provocative, thought-provoking remarks. We really appreciate having you here today. Thank you, everyone, for coming this evening.
Thanks for having me.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.